Mark Whitehead and William Collier, the authors of Smart Tech Society, reject apocalyptic narratives about technological determinism. And yet this determinism is the context in which we are now dealing with technology. The situation was famously diagnosed by the British novelist and lapsed physicist C.P. Snow, who reduced the thinking of his day to two cultures, one of science, which had produced the great leap forward in living standards via the Industrial Revolution, and a second culture of writers and intellectuals who supposedly opposed technological progress and lived in nostalgia for the past. Although Snow gave his famous lecture in 1959, little has changed in an unfortunate epistemic power struggle between technological and sociocultural knowledge. Each new wave of software programming has brought claims that the program doesn't just augment, but surpasses or supersedes human consciousness. There were massive open online courses, or MOOCs, 10 years ago, and then big data, and the metaverse, and then the cryptocurrency revolution. And then as crypto crashed and burned, the New York Times declared the birth of the age of AI, or artificial intelligence, crystallized by the arrival of ChatGPT in autumn of 2022. The two cultures effect appears as the power of technology to present itself as scientific truth and also historical inevitability, rather than as a possible scenario or as big tech marketing. We continue to live in one of those periods where practitioners who bring culturally grounded analysis to technological developments are less likely to be treated as equal partners than to find themselves unemployed, as did, for example, Google computer scientist Timnit Gebru in 2020. This situation, call it tech supremacism, makes Whitehead and Collier's persistence and poise in this book all the more remarkable. The book cuts through not just hype, but two cultures' epistemic inequalities to establish a meaningful relationship between technology and its human users. Focusing closely on the human-tech interface, they explore what they call the ambiguous dependency of people and technology on each other. They insist on the radical ambiguities that are a key feature of the emerging technological world. They have written an impressive work of synthesis. They cover smart tech states and smart tech workplaces, analyze prediction systems and the behavioral theories behind them. They give full scope to descriptions of data systems as the infrastructure of surveillance capitalism, and discuss how Fitbit self-improvement culture can generate a mass of neurotic citizens focused on short-term gains to the detriment of the big picture vision that generates long-term possibilities. They also insist on the promise of more connected, more fulfilling, more effective lives when we control smart tech rather than it controlling us. They insist that smart tech advocates really have no idea where smart tech society is going, which means for them that it's therefore up to us to figure out tech directions. They experiment on themselves, as well as report on experiments with others. People are fully present in this book, and the book's last phrase is directed at us: engage now. Smart Tech Society is the 24th book by an ISRF fellow that we've helped to launch. Among these fellows, we've noted a trend towards building a new framework in which governance and invention are not individual, but collective, which puts new pressure on us to build and control our collaborative systems. For example, in his book, An African Path to Disability Justice, ISRF fellow Oche Onazi redefined disability justice through Ubuntu, a relational, not individualist notion of personhood, one that also does not require, in Oche's reading, symmetrical capabilities among persons. Another fellow, the philosopher Kimberly Brownlee, made a powerful case for the philosophical priority of social rights to individual rights. In Law and Disorder, Ilan Rua Wall analyzed the affects through which people enter their full political life in protest and other collective actions. In Care, Power, and Information, Alexander Stingel called for deep support structures for educational development, health, aging care, housing, and transport as the preconditions for unoppressed human consciousness. Now, Smart Tech Society throws down the gauntlet to us to confront the most powerful calculative and control systems ever devised by humanity and turn them into forces for democracy, creativity, autonomy, happiness, justice, and other things that we might want. The basis of this common governance of technology is the epistemic parity between tech and culture that Mark and William enact in this book. And it made me feel like our collective intelligence really is adequate to our age of the generative pre-trained transformer. Okay, so as Lars noted at the top, the schedule is that Mark will talk about his book for about 15 minutes or so. And then we will hear from our two commentators, Nishat Awan coming to us from London and David Murakami Wood, who I believe is in Ottawa, Canada. And then Mark may or may not respond. And then we would like very much to hear from you. So I'm going to introduce them each just before they speak, starting with Mark Whitehead, who is a professor of human geography at Aberystwyth University. His research interests span urban studies, sustainability, the impacts of the psychological sciences on public policy, and the social implications of smart technology. Mark has authored and edited 11 books and written for The Guardian and Western Mail newspapers. His previous major publications include 2 books, Changing Behaviors on the Rise of the Psychological State from 2013, and Neuroliberalism, my favorite pun title in this entire field, Behavioral Government in the 21st Century from 2017. He has also written on forced governmentality from technology to techne, on just transitions, poverty and energy consumption, also on nudging around the world, a critical geography of the behavior change agenda, as well as a number of papers on various aspects of psychological governance. Mark's work has been featured on BBC Radio 4, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, BBC Radio Wales, and in The Economist. He holds teaching awards from his students in various capacities, and his research has been funded by the ESRC, the Arts and Humanities Research Council, the Leverhulme Trust, us at the Independent Social Research Foundation, the British Academy. Basically, everyone who gives money seems to have given somebody to Mark at some point for this kind of amazing portfolio of research. He is also on the editorial board of the journal Environmental Values. Mark, it's really a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you so much for those thoughts, Chris, and for the invitation to this event this evening. Just to start with a few thank yous, really. I really can't emphasize enough my thanks to the ISRF. Really, to all of you out there, if you're looking to work with an organization that is supportive, creative, and incredibly helpful, and doesn't drown you in the need for metrics measurements, I really would recommend the ISRF's various funding mechanisms. It's been a real privilege to work with them. Just like to thank in advance David and Nishant for also contributing and taking the time to read this book. Given that the book is currently retailing at £81, feedback has been quite slow coming, as you might imagine. Do hold out for the paperback, though, which will be a little bit cheaper, but it's great to have a chance to talk about the book and to see how people are responding to it and what it's making them think about. I must also mention my excellent co-author, William Collier, who can't be with us this evening because he's currently sailing around the world somewhere. But obviously I'll direct all of the tough questions or ones I don't know to him for future reference, perhaps. But anyway, let's move on. It's obviously a little bit tricky to summarize the book in the sort of 10 to 15 minutes that I've got. And I do sense that it's probably better to do too brief a summary than too long a summary. So I'm going to try and keep things short. And for brevity's sake, I really want to do 3 things. First of all, just talk a little bit about why we wrote the book and why we wrote it specifically now. Talk a little bit about how the book was developed and in particular the underlying research that informed it. And then briefly try and say what I think the volume is trying to say to its audience. So essentially, I'll be covering the kind of the why, the how, and the what of the book. Starting with the why, obviously, as Chris has already intimated, the book focuses on smart technology. So that's technology that involves some elements of self-monitoring, analysis, and reporting. And it can range, of course, from smartphones to cars and fridges and watches and even vacuum cleaners these days. We took a definition that was quite broad of smart technology to also include, of course, things such as Google, social media platforms, digital home assistants of various kinds. So essentially anything that is digital and seeks to learn about us individually and collectively through the digital signals that we give off, either deliberately or accidentally. In her 2019 book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, which, footnote, I personally believe is the most significant, one of the most significant books, certainly, of the first part of the 21st century, Shoshana Zuboff talks about if you see the prefix smart, you should actually simply read it as surveillance. So a surveillance phone, a surveillance car, whatever it might be. And while we are very sympathetic to these critical ideas that Zuboff is describing and developing within her notions of surveillance capitalism, we did feel, as we're writing this book, that to discuss these themes through the lens only of surveillance, while valuable and insightful, does somewhat limit and preempt what it might be possible to say is going on. So one of the reasons that we developed this book was really to try and develop, as Chris has already mentioned, a slightly more ambiguous framing of the relationship between people and smart technology, which really seeks to avoid recourse to an overly dystopian or overly utopian account of what it can do. And in this context, we sought to develop a very loosely defined phenomenology of smart technology, focusing on everyday experiences and adapted relationships with smart technology that people may have, mixing notions of the voluntary and the involuntary, losses and gains, joys and despair, at this kind of social smart tech interface. Another reason that we wrote the book, though, wasn't just theoretical, it was because of the moment in time that we seem to be entering into. And it seems that more and more of our life, of course, is being ordered and sorted and developed through the opportunities of smart technology. And of course, we've also seemed to have reached something of a historical tipping point in terms of the saturation of the world in these technologies. So in 2008, I think there were about an equivalent number of internet-connected devices as there were people on the planet. However, now recent estimates suggest that while we have 8 billion people on the planet, there are now 50 billion internet-connected devices. So we've clearly moved from this notion of it just being about us searching the internet to the internet fully searching and trying to comprehend us more. So we felt that this book was timely, hopefully, in terms of this particular historical tipping point, as it were. But there was a third reason why we wrote the book, and that was a normative perspective. We really wanted to draw attention to agency and how greater understandings of agency can be developed and realized within our relationships with smart technology and our thinking about smart technology as well. We felt that in many ways that those who use smart technology and talk about smart technology possibly overestimate just how smart it is. And one of the key themes running through the book is maybe that smart technology really isn't quite as clever as we sometimes give it credit for. But we're also kind of keen to suggest that humans are perhaps not as stupid as some in the big tech sector might assume. And so we're very much interested in trying to develop notions of agency on the basis that we felt that the best way of preserving agency was to understand how it was currently being expressed, as well as how it was being threatened as well. So that was very much a normative perspective. So that's the why. In terms of the how, we used a mixed method approach, combining interviews with some industry insiders, a limited number, I suppose, in the tech sector, but we focused much more actually on those using smart tech. So we had some interviews with so-called Facebook deleters, who I'll say more about in a moment, conversations, also with various people using particularly social media platforms of various kinds that were generating predictions about their identity. We also developed something called a sense maker survey, which again I'll say possibly a little bit more about later, and an element, as Chris has intimated, of autoethnography. Ultimately, the book really sought not to focus too much on notions of expertise or experts in the field, and not to be too speculative in terms of thinking about the future, but instead focusing on lay interpretations of quite mundane negotiations between humans and smart tech as they are now, as our sort of starting point. Ultimately, we try to understand how people are attempting to make sense of a complex and emergent system and to navigate their way through it through various strategies. We recognize as well throughout the book that often the way in which we relate to smart technology isn't necessarily grounded on a firm notion of rationality or a clear form of intentionality. So in the wise words of David Snowden, we didn't necessarily interpret every blink as a wink. We were very much open to the fact that sometimes people aren't fully aware of why they're engaging in smart tech in certain ways. And we tried to develop methodologies that could allow us to explore varied forms of irrational behavior and also subconscious kind of connection with these technologies. Ultimately, what we've sought to do, I think, is to draw attention to the messy negotiations and compromises and struggles that define the human smart tech interface in various forms. So that's the how. As for the what, I'll try and draw out, I think, just one or two examples of things that we've explored in the book. And it's very difficult, obviously, to give a comprehensive overview of all the chapters. But the book explores different zones of connection between humans and smart tech. And that includes how people react to social media predictions and marketing, how smart technology is impinging on working life, also personal health and wearable technology, and the emergence of digital welfare systems and what it might be like to be on that frontier as a welfare recipient, now being kind of regulated and monitored by smart technology. We also looked at aspects of smart cities, particularly in places like Singapore, in relationship to emerging forms of neighborhood surveillance and also elderly monitoring systems. And we also, towards the end of the book, looked at developments within slow computing, and as I've already mentioned, emerging movements of Facebook deletion. So just to draw on three examples of what we looked at and sort of what emerged, just to give you sort of snapshots rather than definitive overviews. In one of the chapters, we sought to use a SenseMaker survey, which confronted people deliberately with the kinds of predictions that smart tech was making about themselves, and encourage people to reflect in some depth, both qualitatively and quantitatively, on how they responded to the predictions that smart tech generates. And we've all, of course, experienced these and their relative levels of accuracy and inaccuracy. And one of the interesting things we noticed, and perhaps it's not that surprising, is something of a prediction paradox, which it seems to be that the more accurate and effective, essentially, this job smart tech seems to get, the less likely people are and willing to expose themselves to its surveillance. And in this context, we noticed some interesting things emerging that could almost be described as a kind of negotiated dual technological obscurement, whereby people were cleverly trying to hide their true intentions and reveal less about themselves on smart tech as it improved. While at the same time, there was a suggestion in certain literatures that smart tech itself and the surveillance tech industry may be strategically not revealing itself to be as accurate as it could be. And we found this kind of dual obscurement technologically to be quite interesting, and it seemed to be generating something of an opacity to the relationship between people and smart tech, which wasn't necessarily that helpful, but was nevertheless kind of interesting in terms of the emerging dance between smart tech and people. In another section of the book, which focused more on smart workplace environments, we drew on perhaps the obvious example of Amazon fulfillment centers, perhaps as the most definitive example end-to-end of a smart tech workplace. And we sort of sought to drew on various whistleblower reports and accounts of what it is like, of course, to work in these highly smart tech saturated environments. And what we found most interesting is that while there is this kind of discussion around efficiency and the delivery of a good service both to consumers, I suppose, and to an extent, the idea of making working life perhaps a little bit less labor intensive, that within the accounts of Amazon fulfillment centers, what we see is that increasingly humans seem to be expected to keep up with machines and the smart tech, rather than the smart tech and the machines necessarily shouldering the burden of human expectation. It was also noted that within the increasingly complex logistical systems that smart tech is coordinating within Amazon fulfillment centers, that the notion of human expertise and understanding of the workplace was also being undermined. And we found this idea of expertise being undermined, a particularly interesting one in the context of Pasquale's recent discussions around the new laws of robotics, and this idea that the loss of expertise isn't just important for human dignity, but also our ability to feel like we have something to say. And it may well be that actually losses of efficiency that smart tech bring and a winding back of those efficiency gains may actually be worthwhile in terms of the consolidation of human expertise, however imperfect, if it enables humans to still have something valuable to say in terms of the coordination of working and social life. A final example that I just wanted to draw on was an extensive study that we did with Facebook deleters that I've already mentioned, trying to understand why people deleted Facebook and the consequences it's had on their social and working lives, actually. Interestingly, with Facebook deleters, the first thing that you find when you actually encounter and find these people and interview them is that they're actually often not actually Facebook deleters. They have kind of stepped off the platform. They're in various waiting zones. Some have gone off and come back on, and it is a much more complex and negotiated process. But what our discussions did reveal was that the expansionist logic of smart tech, particularly in the context of social media networks, more and more users, more and more content, more and more revenue, did seem to be pushing the limits, both in terms of human mental health, as you might accept, and biology, but also the notion of trusted social interaction. So the people that we spoke to in terms of Facebook deleting weren't deleting because of Cambridge Analytica, and they weren't deleting because they were scared of sharing information with Facebook. They just didn't feel that they could trust their own social network because it had grown to such a large extent. Interestingly, in the context of that work and a spin-off publication that we had, this was the one point at which we had someone from Silicon Valley, a tech entrepreneur, reach out and contact us. Who they were quite interested in what these insights might mean for future forms of social media development. And we took that as being, we didn't take it too seriously necessarily that it was going to change the nature of the smart tech society, but we did feel that was kind of interesting, that there was a desire, certainly within certain sections of a complex world of Silicon Valley, to understand how it might be possible to develop a more humanized form of social media environment. So by way of conclusion, because I think I'm coming quite close to my 15-minute limits, one thing I would say about the book, having gone back through it myself, is that of all the books I've written, I feel this will be the book that will date very quickly. And already I feel a little bit ashamed of some of the things that we didn't quite anticipate. And we don't say an awful lot about AI apart from in passing. And maybe that is something we could bring out of the discussion. But by way of conclusion, I think that what we do try and establish in the book are the different options that we currently face in relationship to our relationship with smart tech, algorithms, digital technology more generally. Of course, there is the option of some kind of preemptive withdrawal from this kind of technological realm, which seems highly unrealistic. Of course, there is the transition to ever greater responsibility for smart tech systems, and we're seeing this, of course, with the AI debates at the moment. We see this as being probably equally as unrealistic as well as undesirable. Of course, there is this attempt to try and develop a more negotiated form of existence, of which actually there is a lot of existing evidence, if you look closely enough, that is neither utopian or dystopian, but is about these kind of uneasy compromises, individual action and collective action. One of my favorite authors in this area is actually not an academic, and he may well be in the session, David Berrowby, who's a writer on robotics and the social implications of robotics. But he drew my attention to recent developments in Centaur chess, which reveals that the best AI, when combined with the best human player, so for those of you that don't know, Centaur chess obviously combines artificial intelligence with human players, but the best AI with the best person, the best human player, but with a poor process of connection, is far less effective than a moderate AI with a moderate human with a really good way of working together. And I think that model of how we might collectively seek to forge and shape a more effective interface between humans and smart technology that does seek to reflect what we want it to do, not just how it can make most money, and also secure notions of human dignity and expertise and desire, does seem to be certainly a desirable future, and certainly one that isn't just devoted to making human life more and more machine readable. And that, I think I'll draw my conclusions to, my thoughts to a conclusion at that point.
Our first of two commentators is Nishat Awan, who was trained as an architect, taking her PhD in the field from the University of Sheffield in 2011. After completing a postdoc at the Technical University of Berlin, she returned to the University of Sheffield as a lecturer and has subsequently held posts as senior lecturer in the Center for Research Architecture at Goldsmiths, University of London, and in the Faculty of Architecture and the Built Environment at Delft University of Technology. She is currently lecturer in University College London's Urban Lab, where she leads the ERC-funded project Topological Atlas, which aims to produce visual counter-geographies of the fragile movements of migrants as they encounter the security apparatus at various borders. She has particular expertise in the migrational corridor from Central Asia to the Eastern Mediterranean, and is a leading thinker in the technology of what she calls digital witnessing, technology that she often combines with ethnographic and related qualitative research methods. This allows her to generate integrated understandings of the relations of individuals to these technologies, particularly when the individuals have been massified by migration and related social phenomena. She is the author of Diasporic Agencies, out in 2016, one of the first books to address how architecture and urbanism can respond to the consequences of increasing migration. She is co-author of the influential book Spatial Agency, Other Ways of Doing Architecture, out in 2011, as well as the author of many articles, including recently Performing on the Streets, Infrastructures of Subaltern Resistance in Pakistan, and Digital Witnessing and the Erasure of the Racialized Subject. Among many other awards and activities, she was an ISRF Fellow in 2015-16, where her project was called Migrant Narratives of Citizenship, a Topological Atlas of European Belonging. Her work generates both visual analysis and counter-narratives of movement and belonging that challenge prevalent conceptions of Europe, of citizenship, and of the relations among populations of incorrectly polarized regions. Nishat, thank you for being with us.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the introduction, Chris. And thank you for the invite to discuss the book as well. As I was saying, I really enjoyed reading it. And I especially found the introduction really useful as you sort of place the content of the book within popular culture. And I think, as Chris mentioned earlier as well, I was really struck by the very balanced tone of the book. And this is really a feature all the way through every single chapter. You know, I think what's already been sort of said within this kind of very fraught context and the hyperbole associated with, you know, the discourse around technology, this was really appreciated. But I will come back to this topic in the end about this kind of balanced nature and what I found perhaps was a question, the main question that I have for you, I guess. You know, the book, obviously, as Mark already pointed out, is about these smart technologies. And somewhere in the book, you sort of call them labor-saving luxuries. And I think that's a really good phrase because for me, it really encapsulates the kinds of technologies that that you were discussing, but also the very particular set of people and the very particular context within which these technologies are being used at the minute. And probably you can see from the introduction that Chris also gave that I'm sort of, you know, more interested in the kind of edges, you know, the kind of marginalized sort of uses of technology. And I'm going to think through that to what you've written in this book. And so this notion that again was mentioned earlier about, you know, this idea that those who are producing the smart tech society do not really know where they're going, right? Somewhere in the book, you sort of say the architects of the society do not even know where they're heading. And so there's this kind of indeterminacy within this context. And I suppose I wanted to sort of question a little bit this idea of the indeterminacy and to sort of, you know, think about it through, let's say, the context I know very well, which is that of migrants and refugees. And, you know, it's a kind of example that quite a few people have used of kind of how blockchain technologies, you know, blockchain technology for currency was first sort of developed and used, of course, within the context of refugee camps. So this notion that certain kinds of technologies are produced within certain contexts, usually for marginalized people, and then they sort of, you know, morph and change and end up in things like, I mean, not that blockchain technology has ended up in the smart fridge, but you know what I mean? There's a kind of moving of technology across different realms. And Louis Amour has written, I think, quite interestingly about how technologies from the corporate world go into the world of kind of border control, for example, or Simone Brown's book, Dark Matter, speaks of how surveillance started, of course, with this kind of surveilling of Black bodies, and then it's sort of something that, you know, polices and subjugates all of us in some ways. And so the indeterminacy and neutrality of where this tech, or well, I've put in the word neutrality, which is maybe a bit unfair, but the indeterminacy of where this comes from, this idea that the sort of people don't know where it's headed. I guess I want to sort of question that in relation to a conversation I had with somebody whose PhD I'm supervising at Goldsmiths, Helen Brewer. And it's a little bit off topic, but I'll come back to why I'm sort of mentioning this. She does a research on the topic of migration. And she's writing about this idea of the compliant environment in the context of migrants and asylum seekers in the UK. So the Home Office is creating this compliant environment rather than sort of forcing people to deport, although there are, of course, being deported. The kind of the new approach of the Home Office is to kind of almost coerce people into, you know, into agreeing to be deported and all these other things. And so Helen Brewer is sort of writing particularly about the relationship between compliance, coercion, and care. And I thought, you know, this context, and there, of course, digital technologies, certain kinds of smart technologies are being used within this context too. And so I thought, you know, when you were talking about sort of control and resistance within this idea of kind of the use of smart technology, I wanted to look at this context, which again is one that is very marginalized, but it is within our kind of everyday life within the UK. And really one of the things you sort of come to realize if you look at it within that context is that the technology is being used within a sort of framework of care, right? So organizations who are involved in looking after asylum seekers whilst, you know, they're in these hotels, etc., are sort of, you know, helping people sort of, you know, fight their cases, etc., within this kind of framework of care. But that framework never breaks the kind of system, but in fact sort of reinforces it in a certain way. And so when I think about, you know, this question of convenience and what's happening with the sorts of technologies that we're in, and you sort of speak about, you know, the optimism that we might try to find within this, I sort of wonder, you know, although we are submitting ourselves willingly, you know, this kind of notion of labor-saving luxuries, you know, this kind of idea that a certain amount of care is provided for us with these kinds of technologies is really sort of, you know, duping us into not quite realizing. And I know that you say that people know more than they're let on, but somehow that aspect of, you know, the kind of negotiation that you said, right, the thing that we give in order to have a smartphone, etc. I still think that kind of pervasiveness is there. And if we look at these kinds of extreme contexts, like the kind of coercive environment that the Home Office is doing, or the kind of refugee camp environment, we begin to see the kind of the ways in which, you know, they might come into our world. And so in terms of what happens next, I was thinking a little bit about, you know, the kind of the breakdown of Twitter and how many of us, you know, academics especially, move to Mastodon, this or this kind of what's called the Fediverse, this kind of distributed set of you know, servers that produce a social network. And so, you know, this, I suppose, for me is, you know, it's not that kind of slow negotiation with power, but it is a kind of another world that is being built in parallel to the corporate world. And I think the breakdown of Twitter really told us that, you know, things change so quickly, right? And suddenly, you know, there is this kind of alternative when we thought there was no alternative to Twitter. And so I think, you know, with the kind of example of, let's say, how these technologies are being used for kind of marginalized people, on marginalized people, and then thinking about this kind of more distributed technology that is there already. I wonder if, you know, in the kind of balance of the book, we would want to push a little bit more towards a kind of utopianism of distributed technologies, I suppose, and you know, I guess I'm a little bit more optimistic. Not optimist. I'm a little bit more negative than you. That I do think that, you know, some of some of these avenues are close to us because of the way they are sort of, producing certain effects for certain kinds of people. So while some of us could make a middle path, for others, perhaps that's not the case. So I guess, yeah, those are my comments, that, I do wonder about that kind of question of which humans and this idea of labor-saving luxuries, and how we can think through the kind of more extreme uses of this technology to question our smart fridge. Thank you.
David Murakami Wood, educated at Oxford and Newcastle. He is professor of critical surveillance and security studies in the Department of Criminology at the University of Ottawa. He's also a faculty member of the Center for Law, Technology, and Society, and an associate of the AI Plus Society Initiative. He was previously at Queen's University at Kingston, where he was the director of the Surveillance Studies Center, an associate professor in the Department of Sociology, and also Canada Research Chair in Surveillance Studies. He is an interdisciplinary specialist in, as you can tell from his titles, in surveillance, security, and technology in cities from a global perspective. And he has worked mainly in Canada, the UK, and Brazil. He is a leading organizer in the field of surveillance studies as co-founder and now co-editor-in-chief of the international open access peer-reviewed journal, Surveillance and Society. He is also co-founder and director of the Surveillance Studies Network, is director of the Surveillance Studies Center of Canada, the successor organization to the SSC at Queen's, and is co-editor of Surveillance Studies, a reader out with Oxford University Press in 2018, of Big Data Surveillance and Security Intelligence out with UBC Press in 2021, and of the International Handbook of Surveillance Studies out with Edward Elgar. He has also been an environmental, peace, and indigenous rights direct action activist, working with pressure groups and political parties, particularly the short-lived but influential Earth Action Resource Center, or Earth ARC, as well as Earth First, Stop the War Machine, Oxfam, and the Green Party of England and Wales. He has also taught English and served as a research fellow in Japan. David, I feel like I'm probably just scratching the surface of this, so thank you very much for being with us.
Right, I just want to thank Mark and everybody in this organization for the opportunity to respond to this really stimulating and fascinating book, which I found very rich and I got a lot out of. As I said to Mark before we started, I'm not going to spend my time commenting in detail on the book itself. You can read the book. I'm instead going to take the book as a kind of inspiration and see where we can go with things. I also want to thank Nishat for some really excellent and perceptive comments, which I think also will be, as you'll see, somewhat compatible with what I'm going to say. The word smart is a really strange word to describe intelligence. There are many words we could have chosen for this kind of technology. When we talk about artificial intelligence, we use that word directly. We don't say artificial smartness. Smart has a weird etymology. In its origins as an ancient English and Germanic word, it actually means wounding or cutting. It's something that is painful, literally means painful. And we see the echoes of this still in the terms when you say a cut smarts or it hurts. It's also the origin of the term smart, obviously in terms of fashion as well, that kind of well cut and precise. But it has that element of pain, of wounding to it. And I want to keep that in the back of my mind, the back of all of our minds as we go forward with the rest of this discussion. I like it because it always reminds us that intelligence is not just something that is neutral, is not just something that is good, but is something that can be profoundly dangerous. The Manhattan Project was developed by the most intelligent people of its generation. Those people who later were able to step back and say, I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. This kind of thing. It's not necessarily something that is neutral in that sense. And I think in some ways, neutrality, whether it's studied or whether it's accidental, is something we don't want necessarily in this situation. That'd be my one, if you like, criticism of the whole book, the book as a whole, is I think maybe stepping off that neutrality would be a good thing eventually. I've got a number of propositions I want to basically just go through very quickly, and then I'll have some suggestions for how we might start to pursue those in the future. I'll try not to go over 5 or 7 minutes, but we'll see. I've got my timer up here. First of all, as Mackenzie Walker said, if we do not include the Anthropocene in our social theory, then what are we doing social theory for? We're in the midst of a planetary ecological crisis, where in reality, multiple parallel intersecting and interacting crises. It's not possible, it's not coming, it's not in the future, it's now. And with social acceleration, the consequences of this are coming faster than ever. In that sense, we're no longer looking forward to a science fictional world, we're living in a science fictional world. And in fact, your references to Philip K. Dick and others, very important there, because I think it makes us realize we're living in their world now. We're living in Ballard's world, we're living in Dick's world. It's vital as well that whatever approach we take, we don't neglect the capitalism in surveillance capitalism, or the capitalism in platform capitalism. The economy remains a main driver of transformation, and we shouldn't reduce any political economy we decide to take to a technologically determinist account, even if it's one which is, neutral or perhaps even beneficial. Very important for my particular approach is that I would argue that surveillance is crucial to this new smart planetary condition, with AI-driven computing threatening to overlay and interpenetrate existing and social ecological systems at every scale. Fifth point, as Simone Brown argues, surveillance exists in a colonial present as well as colonial past. Globalization as a phenomenon was a kind of renewed generic kind of colonialism extended to the whole planet, and the Anthropocene is very much also the Plantationocene that Haraway called it, or the Capitalocene as Moore termed it. In many ways, it's literal, as states and corporations buy up whole regions of poorer countries to secure crops or resources. And in this context, smart tech is as much data colonialism or tech colonialism as anything else. I would say smart surveillance works at this scale and perhaps at all scales by a constant modulation between a sort of caring biopolitics and productive inclusion, or even luxury, as Chris Gilliard and David Columbia term it. And on the other side, a necropolitical uncaring and destructive exclusion of the type that refugees and migrants are subject to, as Nishat would no doubt be able to tell you. And this produces, refines, reduces or eliminates possibilities for different groups. It empowers some people, groups and things, surveillance, and smart technology disempowers, dehumanizes and oppresses others. On the other hand, though, it doesn't work. This is one thing that comes clear in the book and elsewhere. Smart surveillance is encompassing and panoptic only its imagination, as Jody Dean observed of technologies back in 2009. Like all surveillance in practice, as Bruno Latour, the late Bruno Latour pointed out, it is oligoptic. It's fractured, as Graham and Marvin said way back in the early 2000s. It's overhyped and is beset with breakdown and failure. The COVID-19 pandemic both temporarily hid the crisis, but also highlighted some of the fractures and some of the breakdowns. But it should have enabled us to see some of the methods and techniques that will become more common in the fight to restore ecological balance to this planet. In thinking about a post-COVID smart world, we must take account of this vast machine, as Paul Edwards called it, of modeling and sensing technologies for environmental management, or are they surveillance technologies for social control? Surveillance for our own good is now familiar, but surveillance changes with scale and space, and for diverse communities, especially if the stakes are higher, the consequences invisible, beyond the horizon, or unevenly distributed. The longer we wait, and this is really important, I think, the more the kind of smart surveillance methods used to confront this new reality will be intrusive, authoritarian, and probably misdirected. In other words, the kind of responsibilization gone mad, where individuals are forced to take responsibility for the misdeeds of corporations, using smart technologies to enforce and control that kind of approach. You can see this already with smart water metering, where it became supposedly a tool for water saving and becomes an instrument to beat the poor. There is a significant threat as well, I think, for those, especially in the technology industry, who emphasize the supposed threat of things like artificial general intelligence, combined with a concern for population decline that they see, and instead emphasize these over the multiple environmental crises, which they see as important only insofar as they threaten the flourishing of human consciousness in whatever form that could take over a vast span of cosmic time. These dangerous people are part of an emerging ideological constellation known as TESCREAL: transhumanism, extropianism, singularitarianism, cosmism, rationalism, effective altruism, and long-termism, that has been identified in that form by Timnit Gebru, who was mentioned earlier on, and the work of Emile Torres. Okay, you don't see this very often, but occasionally it slips out in the public. For example, Jack Dorsey praising Elon Musk's commitment to extending the light of consciousness. It's a religion, basically, and we've got to be very, very concerned about it. In fact, I would be particularly concerned about any attempt to do things like assign robots rights and so on, because this is all part of this kind of agenda. And I was quite concerned to see that being taken seriously in this book, for example. That's one concern I had. I think we've got to be very careful of that. So where do we go? A minute. I'll give myself a minute, if that's okay. We need to consider trajectories beyond smart surveillance. And these range from reasserting everyday civic interaction, as Alison Powell advises us, to an empowering right to the smart city, Cardulo and now, and right through to the Luddite option of rejecting smart technology completely. I think it is time to start breaking things. The question is which things, how, where. Strategic Luddism is an extremely important response to the condition we are in. Luddites, by the way, were strategic. They were not just crazy anti-technology people. Our futures are and need to be more diverse, countering Silicon Valley's white, male, techno-corporate futurology. We need to respond to George Monbiot's 2017 call for new narratives to go beyond critical dystopia, to find intellectual tools for transformation and hope. And I think academics are ideally placed for this, but we need to work much more with artists, with architects, with designers, and more to develop better and more fruitful futurologies. I'd say also we need to be careful of the standard legal responses to these sorts of things, i.e. privacy. Smart surveillance and smart tech in the Anthropocene is not best juxtaposed by some kind of planetary privacy, although privacy is important. I think that by social and environmental justice, including global data justice, which addresses power asymmetries and how data are used, seeks distributive justice for forms of making visible and invisible, and inspires the use of data in social justice work, according to Denshik, Taylor, and others. The task we have is quite simply politics. We have to include everyone. We have to define and maximize what is necessary and positive, and minimize, prevent, or abolish what is unnecessary or negative. We have to actually indeed create the possibilities of a planetary polity, which at the moment does not exist. We also need to repel the challenge of the test realists. Not only them, we also need to fight the renewed neoliberalism of the World Economic Forum, the imperial model of China and other minor wannabe empire builders, and the US platform corporate norms. That would argue that civilizational objectives allow us to replace humans as abstract humanity and allow for the dehumanization of people as much as the false humanization of technological objects. Thank you.
Thank you, David. That was really excellent. Mark, over to you for a comment, and then I would like to remind everyone in the audience that you are absolutely invited to start posing questions at this point.
Excellent. Well, thank you for those comments. And this is, exactly what I was hoping for, such insightful and provocative responses to what we're trying to do. And of course, as David said in a pre-meeting we had for this, there's always the book that you could have written or would like to have written, and there's the book you did write. But I think what's really always very gratifying is when you can see work generating responses and thoughtful reflections like that. Obviously, I can't respond to all of those comments, rich and intellectually challenging as they were, but I will pull out a few points, and I think some of them were common, some of them more specific to what Nishant and David said. I think I'd start with this notion of indeterminacy that Nishant particularly touched on, but I think was part of David's comments. And I think it's interesting that you interpreted that as something that we saw as potentially as a positive moving through the book, as in a space of molding and shaping of trajectories. I think we're more inspired, I think, in that context by Zuboff's notion of applied utopianism. And so this notion that what we're looking at within surveillance capitalism and associated systems is an unusual form of utopianism because it doesn't tell us where we're going to go. And that is incredibly disempowering in itself. So you might not like classic utopians, they may be quite restrictive, but they do chart a path. And I think while there is an element of indeterminacy in what we're trying to achieve, I think also we saw applied utopianism as being deliberately obfuscating options as well. So that was really interesting. I also come back to this concept of neutrality, which does keep coming in, possibly as a weasel word, because I've got to check the index. I'm not sure if we use the word neutrality, but nevertheless, that is your response, and I think that's interesting because I've written a similar book to this where I've tempted almost in a kind of pour ancier kind of notion of trying to hold some kind of ground, and I find that what that tends to involve is that you kind of lose allies on both sides of the equation, if you know what I mean. So it's kind of like almost a sort of a post-structural desire to kind of hold things in terms of judgment. And I wouldn't disagree with the limitations that possibly placed on the project in terms of maybe not reaching some of the more critical perspectives that both of you have put forward, and I wouldn't disagree with. What I would say is that I think we were trying to hold off as much as we could analytically. I think ultimately we still ended up using a lot of the nomenclature of surveillance capitalism and related critiques, but I think we were quite keen not to start with them and to see what emerged. But I think that critique of neutrality is a fair one. I will also come back to Nishant's points, I think, which were talking about, I suppose, the different types of people who may find themselves on this interface, and particularly marginal groups. And I think you're absolutely right to draw that kind of capabilities perspective to this. The kind of choices that we're talking about, people being able to make and negotiate, are not constant, clearly. And I think that is one of the limitations of the book that I was very much aware of, that it wasn't able to really kind of look at notions of marginality and identity and capabilities as much as it could have. I think obviously we do talk a little bit about the welfare, digital welfare state, but that is something that we have to rely a little bit more on secondary sources, but it's certainly something that is an ongoing concern moving forward. But I would agree that clearly, as David mentioned, those kind of more authoritarian trajectories that we're seeing emerging in certain parts of the world, that smart technology and surveillance isn't always something that can be negotiated with in a preemptive sense. So there is a you talk about luxury of the labour-saving technologies, but there is a kind of a luxury to some of the aspects of choice that perhaps we depicted from a predominantly Western perspective. So I think that was a very fair point. I was really intrigued and stimulated by David's discussion of the Anthropocene and framing this around that, because obviously we do preface the book with a discussion of Lovelock's notion of the Novacene, and this idea, I personally feel a somewhat optimistic view that AI is the kind of evolutionary kind of response of what humans may need in terms of maybe almost eviscerating humans from the equation, or at least sending us into retirement, while AI can sort of potentially solve many of our problems. And I thought that was an interesting set of reflections. I don't think we followed it through in the book, but I think that kind of geological almost aspect to this technology is really important. I take on board both of the comments that you made, I think, about the idea of the morphing and creeping of these technologies that we're describing, both whether it be data colonialism or the kind of use of certain technologies in more or less innocent contexts that may become more sinister, or more sinister contexts that then become more innocent. And I think maybe that is something we could have developed a little bit more. The robot rights angle is kind of interesting. So I would like to kind of, get into this a little bit more, because it's something that, we're really struck by the kind of related work that was going on in kind of critical robotics studies that you could describe with a kind of smart tech element. We didn't really develop it as much as possible. But I am kind of intrigued, and I'm not saying I have the answers, in terms of how we do think about other types of being, and I take David's point that this could be part of this kind of bigger project of kind of rolling out a kind of a digital logic and colonialism. But I do wonder whether the idea of caring for other forms of intelligence and other forms of existence is a kind of an interesting ethical angle that isn't necessarily always playing into the hands of the big tech elite. There's some interesting work, of course, talking about kind of notions of animal rights that kind of crosses over here. So I think maybe I'll be interested to take that up with David, maybe moving forward a little bit more. But I will maybe finish on the reference to strategic Luddism and strategic Luddites, and I think that's a really interesting point. Part of this book was written in the shadow of a parallel book that was written on slow computing, and certainly discussions around slow computing. And I think one of the feelings we had with that, with the idea of kind of adopting forest browsers and kind of, taking a step back and deconveniencing our digital life, while we were sympathetic to it, did also feel quite elitist in some way. So going back to Nishant's point, or maybe this is where I'll set you both in motion again, not against each other, but in conversation with each other, that those options and those possibilities of withdrawing are obviously somewhat constrained. And certainly we felt that just even within a fairly privileged context, a lot of what was being talked about in terms of slow computing and what you could, I suppose, describe as strategic Luddism were constrained and much more difficult than perhaps we may always be aware of. So yeah, that's I think I've covered most of the major headlines, just looking through my notes here. Oh, just sorry, one last point. Thank you, David, for the etymology of smart. That was really insightful, and I quite like that, the painfulness that you highlighted, because it kind of speaks to the difficulties I had in using that term as many times as I must have in this book. And I'm sure you're aware the strategic decision to use that concept was partly to mark it out from overly critical terms, but also one that was kind of fairly familiar to the kind of people we're working with. So I think that familiarity was almost why we chose it, but I can see why it was a strange choice in some ways. And that was one of those kind of intriguing kind of ways and prompts that sort of how it landed with you that I found most interesting.
Just quickly, Mark, I wasn't suggesting your use was strange, just
okay.
the use of it as in general as a term for...
Okay, sorry, maybe I misinterpreted that. And I wasn't taking it personally by any means, but I just think that kind of reaction to the term, because it is interesting, isn't it? It's not about intelligence, and it is kind of a shorthand term for something that has certainly been commercialized fairly effectively. But thank you. Anyway, I will stop there because I'm sure there are other people who would like to join the conversation.
Mark, I have a question for you in relation to the two comments, which has to do with the lay person perspective.
Yeah,
I think it's really important what you're doing, and trying to think about how people are using it and assuming that people are, as you put it, less stupid than a lot of technologists think they are. So they kind of, but I was also struck by the findings about in some of your studies, including the one that you mentioned with in relation to Facebook, says that people got out because they distrust their own friends rather than distrusting the corporate platform or the global surveillance security apparatus. In other words, that the problem is their immediate friends. It's not the NSA.
Yeah.
And so I'm just wondering, like, in relation to what Nishant was saying about the people who are more at the sharp end of this, migrants, refugees, can we upgrade our understanding of the lay person, or re-theorize that so that we can demand a kind of sophistication from, I don't know, I hate to use this word, but sort of the normie lay person versus the oppressed lay person?
Yeah, no, I think that's a very fair point. I think that there's a danger, I think, when you kind of take the badge of the laity, that you're sort of speaking for the people, and it kind of gives you a kind of a justification. But of course, what we're speaking to is a very small group of people who, to be honest, aren't on those margins. And I think the challenges of doing that kind of research are difficult, and it's certainly something that is emerging in terms of my own work on the digital welfare state at the moment, to sort of widen that pool of what you could describe as layperson. I think just going back to your previous kind of intimation about not trusting, I know this isn't really what you're driving at in the question, but not trusting your own friends. I think what I was driving at more there, you are right, that is part of it, but I think it's just that we all know that sociologically keeping a network of 500 people is kind of a fairly well-established notion of who we can trust and who we can't. And just at smart tech, by definition, those people we call friends take us well beyond traditional sociological limits there in terms of trust. But yeah, I take that point about the laity, absolutely, that it does need, I think, a broader understanding.
So have a question for David about this idea that you raised, that I've been thinking about a lot in relation to sort of green transitions, world government. I grew up in Los Angeles, where some of my parents' friends were very conservative, and this was the thing that they feared the most, was this idea of world government in which the United States wouldn't have its sovereign sort of dominant position. And there would be there was a specter of fair exchange among, different societies and cultures around cooperative formation. And you mentioned at one point that we're not yet in a position of imagining this kind of thing. Have you seen anything that has been trying to work this out? Because it feels like time is running out on this idea of both in relation to climate regulation, but also in relation to platform technology regulation.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think we're at a point now where the United Nations is possibly at its lowest ebb for many, many years. And this is after a pandemic during which time the WHO has taken the lead in saving the world, essentially. And what has it got for it? It's got accused of being a conspiratorial system that deliberately spread the pandemic and deliberately controlled people for no good reason at all, or made up the entire thing. This is the IPCC, the most active part of the UN dealing with climate change, is also treated in very similar ways by many people. We hardly, if the Secretary General of the UN says something now, nobody pays any attention anymore. We're almost, I think, at the stage that the League of Nations was at the Second World War, where the UN has come to the end of its natural life, but there's nothing ready to replace it. As you say, people in the USA, their politics is so much against that kind of thing. It would be very difficult to imagine otherwise. But I would say to those people, in some ways, without that, this is going to be a world that's entirely dominated by China. If you don't have a United Nations, that's what's going to happen. The US is finished, right? And a good thing too. In many ways, a good thing too. The US platforms are not. US platform corporations are not finished. They're going to go on, but the US as a country is basically finished as a world power. It'll take time, but it's happening already. So India, China, are going to be running the world in the next 50, 100 years. So if the US doesn't want that to happen, it might want to think about investing in a world government because that's really its only hope in that sense. So maybe that's the conversation that Americans should start having now.
Well, do you see that as working through the UN as a place to start?
I don't know. I don't know. But I mean, in terms of
without a Security Council or something like that?
One of the problems is, in terms of smart tech, is that the institutions best placed to put into place a form of global government right now are platform corporations. They literally have the infrastructure, they have the software, they have the abilities, they have some of the expertise. Facebook, of course, I wrote an article on this a few years ago. Facebook published a manifesto a few years ago saying essentially it could run the world. It's Zuckerberg really believes that, whatever you think of Zuckerberg. If it's not him, it'll be somebody else with another corporation like that. But there's a really interesting series of science fiction novels by a brilliant author and academic called Malka Older. The first book's called Infomocracy. In her imagines near future, essentially what happens is that a Google-like organization essentially merges with the UN to create a sort of information platform government for the world. And it doesn't actually run the world, it just gives the world an information platform to allow everywhere to run their own governments, essentially. It's a really interesting idea. And that's, as right now, it's as believable as possible as anything else that anybody's come up with. In other words, not really very believable at all, but useful.
All right, well, we have to keep working on this. We have two questions. The first is from Amanda Gailey. Thank you for this discussion. I am interested in strategic Luddism. What might that look like when, unlike Luddites 1.0, most of us do not have direct access to some of the most threatening technology? David, I think this is for you.
I'll start with you anyway. Briefly. I want to start it, but I think there's lots of examples we can think of. Just to answer Mark's question earlier on as well, when I say strategic Luddism, what I'm talking about isn't kinds of rich white people deciding not to use a technology or deciding to use a browser that's older than their current browser. What I'm talking about is thinking about whether we need a company like Palantir. Right? Should we shut down Palantir? Is this company worth existing? Are the technologies that they deploy worth actually having? I think what we need to get past is the idea that we can't put the genie back into the bottle. This is rubbish. It's a strange metaphor anyway, because in every story that comes from that tradition, you always put the genie back in the bottle, right? We can do that. We can reverse certain kinds of technological innovation, and we can create different futures for technology. None of this sort of idea that there is no alternative, the Margaret Thatcher philosophy, it's not true. So that's what I mean by strategic Luddism, is taking on some of those types of technologies and corporations and saying, we do not need this. We do not need you. You're going to be shut down. right? And the how
So
question
it's
is
more directly involved in the political process rather than with the technology that in this case is, as Amanda's pointing out, is secret.
exactly a 2.0
Classified.
has to be more involved and more sophisticated in terms of the tools you use. It's not just hammers anymore.
Mhm.
Although they're pretty good still.
Do either
I think-
of you want to add anything to that, Nisha?
I was just going to say, I think this is where distributed technology comes in, and some of the things that you were saying earlier, David, about, working with technologists, hackers, architects, even to kind of design another world and to kind of, and it's already there. I think that kind of example of Mastodon and how it's suddenly become something quite, important is sort of, okay, it's not the perfect thing, but at least it's distributed, at least it's something that is not in one thing controlling everything. And so I think, when you talk about strategic Luddism, it's also about, with that, it's creating these other sort of multipolar worlds, I suppose.
We have two additional questions. The first is from Beth Ann Evans. Thank you for a really interesting discussion. Mark, could you tell us a bit more about the digital welfare state?
Yeah, so this was a section of a chapter of the book that we sought to explore what it was like, essentially being on that kind of interface of smart tech, in a sense, in terms of welfare claimants. In the UK, this is kind of linked to the emergence of universal credit, essentially a new welfare payment system. And what we were able to draw on there was a series of emerging reports on the kind of experience of people who are having to go through this system. Essentially, what it's involved is the taking away of direct human contact in these systems. So in some more extreme examples where this has been rolled out in places like India, this has had some really significant issues in terms of literally the computer saying no, and you've had, the failure to deliver welfare payments and really no recourse, no sense of human insight into an individual, human knowledge that could kind of wave things through. In the context of the UK, what's been particularly interesting is that the emergence of the digital welfare state has also been tied very heavily into notions of austerity. So, what we're seeing is the removal of kind of bricks and mortar facilities, where people can go, they can meet, they can get to know individuals who are helping with their welfare claims, they can get support as well. And what we're finding increasingly is that people are having to go to kind of secondary institutions like public libraries just to kind of get access to the internet to get support. But of course, the Conservative government is quite busy in closing public libraries as well. So we're kind of seeing this incredible marginalization of how people are trying to get access to a fairly fundamental needs in their everyday life. Now, that it is about smart tech, partly in terms of the calculations of these requirements. But it's also about this idea of digital first. So the principle that things will be done digitally first, and that is the working assumption. And while and this is kind of where I think David and I are probably most aligned, while it's kind of wrapped up in a kind of discourse of empowerment and inevitability, it seems to be very much undergirded with a kind of neoliberal orthodoxy of kind of not only the kind of this cost savings of the welfare state, but sort of also a kind of fairly nasty use of smart tech to kind of compromise payments and reduce payments. But again, the transparency isn't there, so it's very difficult to know what's going on. And when you speak to many people who are claiming universal benefit, they don't really understand how it's been determined anymore. It is kind of beyond their comprehension and beyond most experts' comprehension, to be honest, as well. So yeah, that's kind of what we're talking about. And I think in terms of the frontiers of this smart tech society, it's kind of one of the possibly the most important, because I think the Guardian actually ran a series of exposés on digital welfareism around the world. So Australia's been kind of getting into this on the basis, again, that they're trying to tackle fraud, that this is much more transparent, much more fair, much more easily accessible. Basically, you can flip over all of those claims, and it seems to be the exact opposite in many respects.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, one of the key things is the increasing use of automated systems and even AI to make decisions within these things. So the Netherlands has had some really big cases about this recently, a national scandal around automated decision making on benefits. You also see this in other areas outside the welfare system, but within the kind of constellation of organizations that basically control poorer people, especially in the justice system. So, for example, AI-assisted sentencing. in the US, which has been used either parole decisions and sentencing. I mean, it gets to the point where this is ridiculous, right? What is the term judge? And the word judge means, using your discrimination to make decisions. And it's precisely those human beings having their discrimination taken away from them,
yes,
by machines. And that would seem like one of the least sort of progressive uses of any kind of machine learning system.
Absolutely. And that speaks again, I think, to this broader issue of the notion of human expertise. And obviously we're all having to go experts, but the fact that there is a kind of an ability to judge and make calls that maybe are not perfect, but maybe the right decision in a human context as well. And I think that, the idea that somehow human expertise is to be treated suspectly and as being as imperfect in the system is deeply problematic.
So Nisha, I have something to say, but I wondered if you wanted to say something first before I do. Okay, so I just didn't want us to speak again before you had a chance. So. But I just wanted to add the fact that the problem, often the justification for this is that human beings are flawed because they're racist, they're biased in various ways, and the system will not be. But of course, as we've seen in work, Timnit Gebru and others I mentioned earlier on, Abeba Behain, other people working in these areas have shown that it's not just that, that these systems somehow inexplicably biased. It's not just that they embody the biases from the people who design them, but they're systematically biased at every stage, particularly in the training data sets that are used. So in fact, they get actually more systematically racist and biased than the individual human judges who they're supposed to replace, or the individual welfare officers who they're supposed to replace.
No, absolutely. I think that example you gave of the Netherlands really showed that very clearly, where the way that the system was kind of making decisions was based on ethnic identity, etc. It was all in there, this kind of racialization. And so, yeah, it's now so obvious that to still pretend that it's not there is kind of strange, but somehow they're still doing it.
All right, we still have two additional questions. The first is from Andrew Robertson. Perhaps smart is to intelligent as cunning is to wise. That is, it assumes conflict, but then social science usually does and usually should. Comments on this, the relationships among these words. Smart is to intelligent as cunning is to wise.
I quite like that, I must say. I think it sort of does speak to something now. I think at the end of the book, the last chapter, I do introduce the idea of intelligence. I thought it was interesting that David rightly kind of drew suspicion towards notions of superintelligence and the dangers that might have within humans as well as in non-human systems. So I think we have to be careful, but I think I'd certainly see smart as having that slightly negative connotation in relationship to intelligence, in the same way that cunning would have to wise, maybe achieving certain goals in certain ways that may not be as ethical as we might like. Yeah, I like that.
I think that's a very British reaction in a sense, because in the US, smart's just the standard word for clever. Like that's just
okay.
how it's like really there's no negative connotations to it generally, except in the word smartass, right? But apart from that, generally, it's just completely good. And I think that's one of the reasons it's become the term. It was IBM, right, who popularized the whole smart city, smart planet, smart everything thing. And so I think British people have a slight more sort of strange relationship to that word, but maybe I don't know, because we don't like to celebrate people's smartness so much, maybe perhaps.
Well, the accusation that you're being smart is definitely derogatory in a sort of a British context, I would say.
Yeah, and when your mother says it in the United States, it's derogatory as well.
Okay, that's interesting.
Okay, and then our final question is from Tom Wooden. Thanks for this fascinating discussion. Mark, are historical parallels useful for your work? And how far is smart tech actually representing something novel? Chris started with C.P. Snow, and there's Luddism, Utopian, et cetera, that all have a long history, as does technology as a contested term.
I'm really pleased you raised. It's a great question, and actually the book starts with a kind of Neolithic kind of context for the smart tech revolution. So drawing on some of Harari's work on the luxury traps of the Neolithic era, the move towards wheat, and the fact that to stop sedentary agriculture at that point would have required mass depopulation, but actually it meant that people's diet was less pleasant, and disease was more widespread, and probably human life was less interesting. But once this had been set in motion, it was difficult. And I think the argument that is made is that the agricultural revolution was very poor for the individual, but very good for the collective in terms of the Neolithic period. And I think in terms of smart tech, I think that in many ways that smart tech is very good for the individual, but actually perhaps not very good for the collective in some respects. So I did try and draw out some historical parallels, and I certainly didn't, while emphasizing the novelty of what we may be entering, I certainly didn't want to suggest that it's unprecedented in terms of how we might understand certain periods. And I think certainly this idea of, a third disruption, that does at one level kind of play into the hands of those who want to sort of big up smart tech's, big tech's kind of stock market value. But I do feel that there are some historical parallels we can learn from previous rounds of major human upheaval, for sure. I think there was a little tail end to that question that maybe I haven't addressed. I'm not sure. Maybe I should look.
Well, just the long history of technology as a contested term. So,
okay, that's fine. That's fine. I think
yeah.
we covered most things there.
David or Nishat?
Nishat?
Well, I was just reading the next question.
Yeah, every time we say there's one more question, there's actually two more. So there is another question.
If you want to read that, I'll carry on. Then you can do the bit in a second.
Well, let's get the other question in, and then
I've just got something to say about this one, so I'll just quickly.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, David.
Yeah. No, it's actually this is the one bit where I really disagree with you, Mark. Is like I was say disappointed to see Harari being given so much prominence, and especially in relation to Graeber and Wenger, who's carefully, meticulously documented, empirically evidenced, book was sort of to put his footnotes in comparison to Harari's completely unevidenced and kind of broadly generalized arguments about things. I mean, he's wrong, basically, by the way, about most of the things he writes about in that Neolithic arguments. I mean, Peter Taylor, if you want to put an urban geographer who does this, he does a very similar job in Extraordinary Cities of showing how cities preceded agriculture in most cases, and in fact the arguments about the Neolithic agricultural revolution are mostly incorrect. We've got a lot of evidence of that now, and archaeology is really finding more and more of it. So I was a bit kind of Harari. I really wouldn't rely on him as a source. As a source. Sorry.
No, it's an interesting point, and maybe in some ways, in the same way that science fiction was used in that chapter, it was more of a sort of stepping off point, if you know what I mean. But no, I take your point. I think there was actually a footnote to a reference to the fact that it's a little bit more complicated than Harari suggests, but. Yeah. Maybe that wasn't quite enough to undo the egregiousness of starting with him in the first place.
Personally, I think David Graeber deserves a little more than a footnote. That's all.
Yeah, that's probably fair. That is fair.
All right, and then I think this final question is final in quotation marks is from Emmanuel Lazega, and probably for Nishat as the lead on it. Are big relational smart tech platforms making it possible for migrants to coordinate and survive, or are these platforms making it possible for powerful police and social workers to undermine collective action among migrants because they can turn their networks inside out?
I think it's a bit of both. I mean, certainly, the use of messaging platforms, etc., do allow people to coordinate, to make networks. But particularly, I think the example that I was giving was of blockchain technology for currency. So in refugee camps, people would be given cards rather than using currency. And I was reading a paper a while ago where, the people who are behind this were sort of advocating that this kind of technology could allow you to have a global database of refugees that would then, and they were sort of saying this as a kind of emancipatory thing, in the sense that, you could take this sort of information and take it out of the hands of states and give it to something like the UN, so that the kind of when refugees are kind of dependent on certain states to provide them with money, etc., it would be better because it would be kind of at another level. And for me, I mean, that's just like so scary, this idea that there's this kind of this network, this database that has everybody's kind of, things like Eurodac that holds the data of anybody who's been fingerprinted and by Frontex, etc. So yes, there are these technologies, and they are useful, but at the same time, unless and until they are part of a kind of more distributed kind of network that is not controlled by certain corporations, by governments, then it can always be turned inside out. So I've given a bit of a balanced answer.
Not neutral though, Nishant.
Not neutral.
I mean, there's some really interesting cases like that. I mean, one of the areas that isn't in this book, and I'm not saying it should be, by the way, because it was very much of its focus, is sort of warfare and, you know, that kind of war fighting stuff. And one of the examples I always use for this kind of thing that, you know, is technology used to oppress or used to kind of rebel is during the American occupation of Iraq back in the 2000s, it was discovered that some insurgent groups had acquired a $20, $25 Russian satellite TV hacking software that allowed them to actually hack into the live streams of the American drones that were flying overhead. So they could see exactly where what the American drones were seeing and where they were going to do things and so on. Of course, the drone program cost billions, right? Billions of dollars to develop this program. And then you've got these guys on the ground with their $20 Russian, you know, TV satellite hacking stuff. Now, on the one hand, you can say, look, this just shows the sort of, you know, asymmetric warfare and all that stuff. But on the other hand, the problem is, of course, in the end, those insurgents on the ground can't use any kind of force to fight back against the American military with any comparative ability. So they could do that, but they couldn't do anything with that knowledge that would allow them to make a viable difference. Whereas the Americans could then just like carpet bomb the entire village in the area if they wanted to. So you get these kind of examples of asymmetric kind of technology use, which seem to indicate there's possibilities. And then you get almost literally the nuclear option. It's like, but they can't destroy you completely, right? So that's what happens in the end. There's a kind of that asymmetric conflict is very, very asymmetric in the other way in the end. And that's actually goes across the board, not just the military use, but almost every platform tech issue.
Yeah, well, it seems like an invitation to more concerted collective work on these systems.
Yeah.
Final words from any of you?
Should be
just to say, yeah, to reiterate my thanks to everyone involved in the session. You know, really insightful and thought-provoking questions. I mean, it's exactly what you want after 2.5 to 3 years of researching and writing a book, is to actually have a set of responses that make you think about it in new ways. And it's precisely what I'd hoped this would be. And I feel very privileged to have been able to have your eyes and thoughts on the book. So thank you so much, both Chris. You know, I know you've read the book and your comments were fantastic, Nishant, and also David. Really appreciate it. Very thoughtful. You know, you gave me, I think, a good sort of discussion there that wasn't you know, unfair, but was kind of challenging. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Thank you, Nisha. Thank you, really great comments. And thank you, Chris, for your introduction and everybody else involved.
Well, yeah, I want to thank you for doing such a fabulous job, all three of you. Mark, thanks for the book. And my final word is read this book. It won't focus at all, but you can tell from the robot on the front.
That's interesting. That's interesting.
Thank you all. Much appreciated. See you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.